Hi. So the objective of this wee run through the video is to, I suppose, outline rubrics as a functionality within Google Classroom, and I suppose some of the things you'll need to know in order to be able to use them. I think sometimes it's quite useful to understand how they look from the student perspective as well. So what we're going to cover first of all is what rubrics are, how you can use them. I'll look at some examples of rubrics I've made, just two to keep it short, but there's lots of scenarios where they fit. How to make a new one, how to reuse and edit one that you've already made somewhere else, because you can reuse them, so you don't have to, add extra effort in when you've already done the work. And marking using one, what people see, and then if you're at the training session, you'd have the opportunity to make your own one. So let's just start with what a rubric is, because it's a kind of in my view, certainly it seems to be more of an American term. You see it quite commonly, or quite commonly I see American educators talking about rubrics, and we might talk about our, success criteria or our learning intentions, as a kind of I suppose, a benchmark of what we're expecting from pupils within a lesson. But this definition that I found on EdGlossary I thought was quite good. A rubric is typically an evaluation tool or set of guidelines used to promote consistent application of learning expectations, learning objectives, or learning standards in the classroom, or to measure their attainment against a consistent set of criteria. So for me, I think the real bonus of rubrics is it helps me as an individual teacher maintain a degree of consistency from one year to the next and from one pupil to the next when I'm marking, because it allows me to really reflect on what I'm looking for in a task. Um, Across the department, if you get in the habit of creating a template classroom and sharing your assignments with each other so that you're all using the same assignment posts, it has the added advantage of most likely increasing the consistency of your grading across the department, because everyone's working from the same clearly stated set of criteria. The benefit, obviously, for pupils is a clearer understanding of what's expected of them, and potentially for you when you're grading, the possibility to maybe have to leave less feedback because the pupil can see where they've gained a grade at a certain point against the criteria in your rubric. And if you have written that rubric fairly carefully, they should be able to determine, based on the mark that they've got for a given criterion, what they did or didn't do, and it'll point in the right direction. Not to say that you wouldn't necessarily want to add other feedback, but particularly in broad general education, it has, I would say, a great deal of potential applications where maybe the tasks are not particularly complex or particularly detailed, and fairly generic feedback is acceptable. So, what would you use them for? The first point I would make is there are some tasks where, for example, you would be marking, say, an essay, and what you're actually looking for is individual points within the essay. So as a normal marking process, you would have the essay, you'd go through it. For each valid point, you would tick within the essay. Rubrics may not be the best approach for that, although it's not that you can't use them. It's just that they work best when you're grading against a set of criteria. So you have a more holistic view of achievements created throughout the piece of work. It's not to say that you can't specify certain things within the criterion. So it could be that you would say, one of your criterion could have 10 valid points made relating to imagery. And you would simply give a grade in that particular criterion in your rubric for the number of points. But what you might also have to do while you're marking it is just copy and paste a nice big visible tick symbol. And as you're looking at the marking view in Classroom, simply just change it to editing view and just copy and paste, use your Control V shortcut to paste your ticks into the document so they can see where they're picking up those ticks, or whatever works best for you. I'll not go into that too much though. So that's the key point really. I think where you can assess based on a criteria or a description, that's where they tend to work. But there are ways to make them fit other things, and sometimes it's worth reviewing how you actually grade a particular assignment to see if it might fit a rubric. So it might speed the process up for you. So anyway, we'll look at some examples first. So here are two examples that I've made already. So within this one here, the actual assignment, this is obviously an example class, so there's no pupil work that's been submitted here, but the assignment was actually a piece of work pupils were doing on paper. So I've got the instructions here. It was a task we started in class and they were taken home for homework. And there's some materials here to help them understand what they, how they would actually do it correctly. And the rubric that was attached here specifies a range of different things that they're going to get a grade for. So the total number of marks here is out of 24. And so in this particular instance, it was preliminary technical drawings, so basically sketched technical drawings. So one of the things is dimensions, and there's a description here of what they need to do. So in here, I've actually stated the individual things they need to add full information for. So we've got overall length and height, large hole, small hole, U-shaped notch, regular notch. So these are the features, and they're getting, as I've said here, 1 mark for full information on each of these, or a half mark for partial information. So on the actual piece of paper, I just went through, checked what they had, made a wee note, and then in here I could just click on whichever of these suited. And if it was a half mark, what I'll maybe show you later is you can click on, say, 5 if it was 5.5, and you can manually override it to 5.5. And I'll not go into any great detail here, but you see with others where there are more generic statements, so these aren't about how many you've done right, it's more, all extension lines and linear dimensions follow standards, not touching outline, traveling perpendicular to surface. So that's more of a holistic view. If it's perfect across the whole page, no errors, 3 points, good. We've got a description saying infrequent minor errors, mostly correct, or basic frequent errors, more incorrect than correct, and no extension lines if it's just not been done. And that repeats really throughout the whole rubric. So we've got fairly similar statements for these, I suppose, for each grade that explain to the pupils what that actually means. And so for me, it's also really helpful when I'm grading a piece of work to have these in front of me, because it helps me make those decisions, particularly where it's a kind of fairly holistic mark and you're having to make a judgment. It keeps you more consistent. So that's one. And the other one I've got here was from one of my photography class assignments. So with the photography class assignments, pupils are basically given a task. There's some fairly detailed instructions here. So, this is the actual assignment itself. So the instructions there are quite detailed about what they've actually got to do. And then the criteria reflects that. So again, for just the number of images that are submitted, they're getting a point per image here. So that's quite clearly stated there. Likewise, the number that make use of a specific element. So you don't necessarily need to have a detailed description in here if it's just a kind of a point counting. But then there are other points like a discretionary mark here, which is, again, a more holistic point. So here we've got some kind of descriptions of what means perfect. So basically nothing could be criticized. Very good, great work, some minor things to reflect on, fair, perfectly acceptable with either 1 or 2 major flaws or numerous repetitive minor issues. So you get the idea. So these are all created as part of that rubric, and for all the practical assignments, which follow a fairly similar path or pattern in terms of the structure, I can reuse that rubric over and over again and just make little tweaks or modifications to individual criterion or bits that I need to, maybe make slightly different for a different context. So that's really some examples and what we can use them for. Hopefully that's getting you thinking. These are probably quite practically focused examples in terms of the type of task, but there's nothing to stop you using them in lots of other scenarios. You just need to reflect on how they would work in the context of what you're doing. So how to make a new rubric is really quite straightforward. So we'll just come back here to the main page in the classroom. And up at the top here, you'll see we've got create and materials, etc. But one we want to go with is an assignment, because that's where we get the option to add a rubric. So I'm just going to make up a end assignment. See, when I've started typing there, the assignment is now starting to save as a draft up here. So as soon as it exists, you can add a rubric. So down here, you'll see rubric. Now, I'll ignore all this stuff here, but what I would point out is if you're going to use a rubric that has points, so you're assigning points within your rubric, it's worth considering making sure that the point value here matches what's in your rubrics. It doesn't have to. For example, if all of your assessments or assignments are graded out of 10, and you make a rubric that actually has 25 points in it, it will simply take the total out of 25 and apportion a proportional amount to your grading system here. So if this was 10 and in your actual rubric there was, say, 20 marks and the pupil got 10 out of 20, on here it will just convert that to 5 out of 10. So it kind of has a proportional relationship. But it gets a bit confusing for pupils, so just keep that in mind. So for the sake of keeping it simple, I'll just make that 10. I'm not going to worry about the topics or the due date or any of that other stuff for now. So we'll just go create a rubric. And then in here, what you'll see is you've got a couple of things that you need to add. You can choose whether you want it to be scored or not. So one without scoring will not have any point values. And you can also decide whether the higher points are at the left or the right-hand side of the layout here. It really makes no odds, it's just personal preference. And you've got some other options here, which you'll get when you're looking at them later, but if you're not happy with it, you decide it's not working, you can just delete it by clicking that. So the first one, let's just call this first criterion. So you would maybe call it something that was pertinent to you, like use of symbols or vocabulary or standard vocabulary range of ideas or something, whatever you want to do. And then here you would have a detailed description of expectations. What is being graded? So for you, you need to think about what you're looking for from the pupils. That should be clearly stated in here. If you are going to give a criterion out of 5 because there's 5 things they specifically need to add, it'd be worth listing them in there. If you're just giving some general advice about what you're looking for, you want to make that nice and clear. And then down here, we can choose how many points we want to make out of. So if it was a simple checkbox, either you've done it or you haven't, you could just do 1 and 0. And you could just put done, not done. Now, if it gets a bit more complex and you've got different degrees of difficulty, you can obviously then add in just by clicking this wee plus, more of them, so 3 out of 4. So maybe make it out of a 5-point scale. And then again, think about what you want to describe those as. Perfect, excellent, very good, whatever. So you just fill that in. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you get the idea. Maybe 0 would be not done, 1 would be basic, or however you want to couch that term in your euphemism of trying to make something not terribly great sound okay. And then in the description, you can choose whether you want to describe what that actually looks like. So in perfect, you might say absolutely no errors, or masterful use of language with lots of imagination, or whatever it might happen to be. So you can put your description into here. I'm not going to bother doing that just because I don't want to drag out the video any longer than necessary. So you can come back here and you can edit that as you need to. So that's your first criterion. You can see it gives you a running total of how many points you've created. So that's showing us it's out of 5 just now. And if I was to just go down here, what you'll see is we've got the wee option here. We can click duplicate criterion. And so if you have a series of criteria, should I say, that are very similar, at least in terms of the scale out of 5 and the descriptions here, just duplicate them and you can just rename them and add any specific details. And you might actually be able to just copy and paste from your success criteria that you've shared with your class, or from task instructions you've already shared as part of an assignment. Just copy and paste those into here so that it all matches up nicely. Yeah, so you would just create as many criterion as you need. You'll see that you'll have your out of 10 here. That'll update again if we duplicate this one. You'll see that'll change to 15. So we've now got 3 criterion. And it's not to say they all have to be the same. You could have one that was out of 2 and then another one that was out of 10. I think 10 is the maximum number of individual points, so just be aware of that. And when you're happy with that, you can simply click save, and your rubric will then be attached to the assignment. You see that we've got rubric 3 criteria, 15 points. Now, I'm not going to bother filling in any of this apart from the topic, just so that it goes into the correct rubrics training topic here. So we'll assign that. That's my assignment sent out. So that's how to make a new one. How to reuse or edit one is really pretty simple. So we'll just create an assignment again. This time, instead of having to make our own rubric, what we're going to do, we're just going to go down here and we're going to reuse a rubric. So you'll see it defaults to this classroom because it's going to assume that we want to reuse the same rubrics we've already used before in this class, but you can also click here to choose rubrics from a different classroom. So if you had a colleague who created a template classroom, there was a rubric in you wanted to reuse and modify for yourself, that's one way you could go about it. But we'll just stick with that last rubric that I created. So I'm going to select that. You'll see it attaches it here. And I can then click on that. And if I want to change it, so I need to modify it, we can go in here and we can play around with that. We can delete levels. We can do whatever we need to do to change it. When we're happy with that, we can click OK. Make sure our points value matches if that's what we're trying to do. And then we just assign. So that's really all there is to reusing and editing. Pretty straightforward. So if we assign that, you'll see that that just posts, and we've got just the same thing again, another example with a different rubric. So that's basically covered how to make one, how to reuse and edit one, how you mark using a rubric. What we'll do is I will just quickly change over to a pupil view here. And we've got that example rubric 1. This task was done on a bit of paper. So if I was a teacher and I was looking at this pupil's work, they would have hopefully just marked it as done because they're not turning anything in digitally. So that's just to let me see that it's finished. They've handed it in class. So for me, if I go and have a look at that dimensioning task, I'll see there's now one turned in. And if I click on that pupil here, you'll see that I have the rubric laid out for me. So as I'm looking at their piece of paper and I'm marking it, I can click on this to see what the details were there. And when you've been through it a few times, you just remember. So as you're marking it, you can just click on the appropriate markers for whatever their quality of work was. Automatically populates this. As I said, if you need to modify it, so you wanted it to be 6.5, you can just put in 6.5 there and that will work fine. So it'll update our total. And that's really all there is to it. And so we could go through with every pupil, do the same thing. Really quite straightforward. Now, although we wouldn't necessarily see it here, what I'll do is I'll just change that slightly, imagining that the pupil had attached a piece of work and we were using the actual grading view. So we'll just attach a file here so you can see how it works. And we'll mark it as done again as a pupil. So if we just go through here and we clear all these, I'm just going to click on them and clear them so it's as though I hadn't marked it. Okay. So that's currently registering as there not being a mark for that. Now, if I go back to all students here and I click on this work, usually when there's a file attached, if you click on it, it will open up in the grading view so you can see the piece of work. Exceptions are if a pupil only submits a link, for example, to an online gallery of images, you have to go about it a different way. You have to go to the gradebook and then find the piece of work in your gradebook and then view work. I think that's the kind of way to get around it. It's unlikely you'll have that issue. I just know that because it comes up in photography classes quite a lot. So anyway, looking at the grading view that you're hopefully already familiar with, we can see we have the pupils attachment here. As I was saying before, if you wanted to add ticks and crosses, you can just go to editing and just search for a tick symbol. Copy and paste a tick symbol from here. Just a quick and easy way of doing it. And if you've got their pupil work there, as long as you've changed that to editing, you can just go in there, paste ticks wherever you want, pop your cursor in, dead quick and easy. You can still use Mote to leave a verbal feedback comment for their private comment. And while you're marking it, you can use the rubric, which is just here. So you can see that we can look at the details by clicking on them. And we can also, if we can't remember the details and we want to read it clearly, we can click on that to open up. I didn't actually post the comment, but you'll see if we click that, it can open up and just keep that in another window so we can see it. So we're happy with that. We can just kind of work our way through, grade with the rubric just the same as we did before, but this time grading at the side. So it's just in my marking view. And When I'm done with that, so I'm just posting that comment now, you'll see that it's marked as a draft. So at the moment, the people can't see that grade, and they won't see it until I return the piece of work. And when I return it, I can either return it one at a time here. Quite often, though, you'd want to wait until you'd marked all of them and return at the same time. But if you are doing that, be aware that you can't save the private comment without posting it. So if you're leaving feedback comments, it's probably just as well to release the grades as you go. So in here, you'll see that that's updated now with the draft because that's come from that rubric. And I can just tick on that pupil and I can return it. That pupil will be able to see what I've done with that rubric. So now that I look at that assignment, I can see that the teacher has returned it. It's been marked. And I can see down here what I got in each of these sections. So I can hopefully understand as a pupil why I got certain marks and why I lost marks. And if you're looking at another assignment, like I was saying, how will pupils see this? So let's just have a quick look. And before it's graded, so this one here is not being graded. So as a pupil, we'll just have a quick look at that other one. So in here, you can see it's not being graded yet, but even before a pupil completes the work, they can still see your rubric. They can still see all the criteria, so they understand what they're aiming for. I would say it is something, if you're using, you need to draw pupils' attention to, point them to it, make sure they actually look at it beforehand. So it's not a bad idea when you're setting a task to give them a couple of minutes to actually just look over the rubric in class, ask any questions about the criteria. And then likewise, when you hand work back, if you've used a rubric, to get the benefit of it, give them a minute or two to actually just look at the rubric, go over what they've picked the marks up for, and hopefully query anything they're not sure about. So that pretty much, I think, covers all the key points. That's what pupils will see. Hopefully it seems quite straightforward. The main, I would say the main point for me though has, as I say, been consistency. It speeds up my marking, makes it easier and quicker for me to make decisions. Means I don't have to write as much actual feedback or record as many feedback comments because it's clearer to pupils why they're getting marks. And so if you just make up one rubric and try it out, particularly for tasks where you know you're going to have to do a lot of marking, it certainly is time well spent because you can keep reusing that rubric over and over again, and colleagues in your department can reuse it if you put it in a template class. If you've got any questions about how to use them or you're having any problems, do let me know, but hopefully that was helpful.